So what if you could get paid to learn to code? That's the premise behind hire, train, deploy programs, sometimes called recruit, train, deploy programs. Now, these programs started to become popular a few years ago in Europe, and they've made their way to the United States. They're run by mostly staffing companies, and the premise is they will hire learners, pay them a small wage while they're learning to code, and then they deploy them to an employer partner. So this is a really interesting alternative to boot camps, and as the boot camp space continues to struggle, I think that these programs are going to be more of a path forward. So my goal today is to explain to you what these programs are, and from the perspective of the learner, the staffing firm, and the company, what are the pros and cons? And if you stick around till the end, I'm going to explain to you what sort of things you can look for in a quality program and give you some advice on making it through the admissions process, which is very competitive. So let's talk about how the model works. Now, it starts with employment. That's the hire or recruit part of the acronym. Now, you're gonna interview just like you would for a job, and they're gonna be very selective because they are going to pay you to learn. So this is an investment on behalf of the staffing firm in your future. So these programs can be really competitive to get into, especially in a tough hiring market like now. And once you earn your way into the program, you are going to be asked to treat learning like your job. It's very similar to a boot camp. It's going to be very intense. It's going to be very fast paced because they're paying you to learn. So the longer it takes for you to become job ready, the more expenses they incur and the lower their profit margins are. So they are looking for people who can hit the ground running and learn quickly. And we'll cover more about that later, about how you can earn your way in and impress the recruiting firm. Once you've completed the training, they are going to place you with an employer partner. Now, the good thing about these companies is that they often have jobs already set aside by the employer partner for their program. They don't usually run programs unless there's jobs at the end. Now, this isn't a job guarantee. Things can change, companies can back out of those agreements, and people can be stuck without jobs, but it's a lot surer bet than a coding boot camp. So you're gonna go work for this company. What's gonna happen? You're going to get a pay raise first. So you're going to get a very low wage when you're learning. You're going to get a higher wage when you join the employer. And then depending on the length of the contract that you work for that employer, this can be 90 days, it can be 1 year, it can be 2 years, you will convert and you will have scheduled raises during those periods. Now, what's the downside of that? Usually those rates are going to be slightly lower than market rates because the company wants to recoup the cost of paying for your training and your hiring. There's also a contract in place. So if you think that you're going to, get paid to learn and then get put in a job and you don't like it and you're going to quit, well, the contract is usually going to forbid that. And there's going to be some penalties in there. You might have to pay the staffing firm back for the training. So that's just one thing you should be aware of. But at the end of the day, after a period of time, you will become a full-time employee of that company. So now let's talk about the pros and cons from each of the parties involved. We have the learner, we have the staffing firm, and we have the company. And let's start with the learner. So the obvious pro of this approach is that you get paid to learn, and your chances of getting placed if you complete the program is very high. And that's because these staffing firms don't run programs and don't put people in these seats unless employers have agreed to give them opportunities on the other side, because no business is going to pay people to learn if they can't recoup those costs on the back end. Now, it's not a job guarantee. Things can change and companies can change their mind about their hiring needs, and that does happen. But compared to the regular market that you would see at the end of a boot camp or, a college degree program, your odds of getting placed are way higher than they are in those other opportunities. Now, another advantage is that you are going to get industry relevant training, because again, the companies aren't going to reserve those slots for hire, train, deploy candidates unless they're learning the things that the company wants them to learn. And also, you're going to have a period of time to get you that initial experience. It's very difficult for people to get their first job in IT, but their second, third, and fourth job are much easier. So if you can get in there and get a year or two of experience, that will set you up better for the future than other options. But all these pros don't come without cons. So let's talk about the downsides of hire, train, deploy. And the main one is the contract that you have to sign. Because at the end of the training, you are going to have to go work for one of their employer partners. And you're going to have to do that whether you like that employer or not. And you're going to have to work out your term with that employer whether you like them or not. Now, there are ways out of those contracts, but usually they involve financial penalties. Like you might have to pay them back for all of those training dollars, and there might be an additional fee on top of that to compensate the company for the revenue they were going to lose. So breaking these contracts can be very expensive and legally risky. So again, you get into an employer, you don't like your team, you don't like the work you're doing, you don't like your boss. In most cases, too bad. You're going to have to tough it out. So depending on the length of that contract term, whether it's 90 days, 1 year, or 2 years, you may be in for a long haul of job dissatisfaction. Now, my advice to people if they end up in that situation is to just tough it out. Because if you get to that 1 year or 2 year of experience, it's going to make a big difference in your future career. You can leave, you can change jobs, usually get a pay raise, and you're going to be good. Now, during that period, you also have to realize that you're probably going to be paid less than market rates because you are locked into those employers. So there's no incentive for them to pay you premium rates. That's just an opportunity cost. And in IT, your salary is going to grow with your experience and your skill level. So if you learn a lot and you develop those job skills, you're going to make that money back later. So that's not something I really tell people to worry about at the beginning. Your job is to gain skills and gain experience, and the money will come later. And lastly, this training program, because that staffing firm wants to get paid and they want to keep their employer partners happy, it's like a boot camp plus when it comes to expectations and stress levels. So you better be prepared if you're accepted into a hire, train, deploy program that they are going to be watching you and expecting you to perform. And some people already have struggles with the boot camp pacing and the stress that involves. Well, this is an even higher level than you're going to see in a boot camp. So just be aware of that going in. You are going to have to manage your stress. You should set up your life in a way that you'll be able to handle that kind of intensive training and those kind of intensive expectations. So now let's talk about the staffing firm perspective. Now, pros and cons. The biggest pro is that they get to build a pipeline of talent that their employer partners want. So that lets them kind of keep their finger on the pulse of the market. It lets them build relationships with the candidates, because someday that candidate is going to become a hiring manager, or they're going to want to change jobs in the future, and the staffing firm might be the first pick for them to be placed again. So building those relationships is really important for the staffing firms. And on the employer side, now the staffing firm is becoming a trusted partner. They're going to get more information on what that employer needs, what their future plans are, what kind of skills they're falling short in. And that can ripple through the entire staffing organization, because they're not just going to get data about entry-level hires. They're going to get data about the mid-level and senior level gaps that employer has. So all of this just kind of binds the staffing firm and the employer together a little more tightly, makes the relationship more sticky, and that leads to higher revenues and higher profits in the future if they play their cards right. Now, the biggest cons for the staffing firm is the upfront cost. They need curriculum, they need instruction, they need the money to pay the learners while they're in the program, and they also need to be able to float them on the other side. Now, the float, when you're talking about staffing firms, they're paying you every 2 weeks like an employee, But oftentimes the employer is paying, 30 days, 45 days, 60 days later. So there is a need for the staffing firm to have enough cash to be able to support those people until the employer starts paying. And if somebody doesn't get placed right away at the end of the program, most staffing firms will leave them on the books. So they start racking up more cost. And that's a risk that the staffing firms are willing to bear. And that brings us to the employer partner. Now, there's a lot of good in this for employers, and most of it is reducing the risk of hiring. Because when an employer hires out of a hire, train, deploy program, they know what curriculum and what skills those candidates are learning. There's also a larger pool of students for them to choose from. And that means they're going to have a lot less risk, because hiring an entry-level developer, I've mentioned this before on the channel, it's very risky because an entry-level developer takes a lot of time to train up. Sometimes you don't know how good of a worker they're going to be. Well, guess what? In a hire, train, deploy program, they've been observing you as a learner and you as a student for 10 to 12 weeks. So now there's a lot more data on what type of person you are, what kind of work ethic you bring, how you interact with your peers, and that makes the employers a lot more comfortable than just rolling the dice out there on the random market. And that's really what a lot of these employers are paying for. And when I was a hiring manager at companies, there were a lot of gaps. When I went to hire entry-level people, like they didn't know about source control, they didn't know about, common architecture patterns, unit testing. There were a lot of gaps coming out of those college experiences. And if you're an employer and you're willing to hire entry-level people, your only option is to really roll up your sleeves and train those people yourselves. And if you happen to be on a team like mine was, where we had a lot of work to do, it was very difficult to take senior developers offline to mentor and train entry-level people appropriately. Well, guess what? Hire, train, deploy, the employer gets to skip most of that. The staffing firm is taking on that burden for them. So that saves them time, money, and risk. Now, what are the downsides? Well, whenever you save time, money, and risk, you're paying for it. So the way these hire, train, deploy contracts work is that the employer is going to either pay a placement fee after like 90 days, or they're going to contract that employee at an hourly rate for a year or two. And most of these staffing firms, they are making anywhere from $20,000 to $40,000 in profit per placement. So that's the opportunity cost for the employers. And if you're an employer who's going to hire at scale, there is a level where your hiring needs might say, hey, we should build our own academy program like the one at JP Morgan Chase or Citibank. There are some programs out there that you'll see advertised where employers run these academy programs themselves. And usually that's because they have a lot of entry-level hiring needs and they're not getting what they want from the market out of colleges, universities, and coding boot camps. So they decide just to bring it in-house and do it themselves. And that's something I've personally helped companies do. I have built academy programs for Fortune 500 companies before. And it's a really interesting model, and it's not as expensive as a lot of employers think. But I understand the hesitance. If you are an employer, you're not a school, you're not a training provider. So I understand why a lot of employers choose to go with the staffing firm, because it's less risk and they can just spin it up and down however they want. And that leads to better cost controls for those employers. So now that you understand the players involved and what their motivations are, what are some hire, train, deploy companies in the space? Now, in the US, the ones you're going to hear about, Reviture is probably one of the biggest ones, FDM Group, HTD Group, and Dev10. There's many more out there, and I recently attended a staffing firm conference, and this topic was a big topic at the conference. So I expect to see more hire, train, deploy programs coming online, not only in software development, but in other areas of business needs in the future. So go out and research it. You can search for hire, train, deploy or recruit, train, deploy, and you will find a lot of companies in the space. Now, the next question I want to answer is, what should you look for in a hire, train, deploy program if you want to throw your hat into this ring? Now, I said previously that one of the benefits is that the curriculum that they teach is tailored towards employers. But that doesn't mean that that particular employer wants things that are popular in the market. So you should always be sure to review the curriculum and compare it against the job postings in your region, because it's not uncommon for a company to be struggling to find talent because they're using legacy systems or because they're using niche products. Now, it's not a bad thing. You're still going to get trained, and there's a very high likelihood of getting a job. And if your goal is just to get any job, that's not a problem. But if your goal is a long career, if you have a certain career path in mind or a certain vision of how your career should play out, then be sure to evaluate the curriculum against the market and against what you want to do. The second thing you're going to want to look for is the quality of instruction, both during the program and the support you're going to get after the program. So once you transition from that learning into your job and you're a contractor there, what kind of support do they give you? And this varies wildly. Some companies kind of throw you over the fence. They assign you to a project manager, and good luck to you. Other companies will continue to give you training, mentorship, and support during that contract period. That does cost the staffing firm money, and it lowers their margins. So I understand why not every company does that. But a good company that cares about the longevity of the program and cares about both the employer and the learner experience is going to provide that extra support. And one of the biggest things you need to do is review the contractual obligations. Do not sign up for a hire, train, deploy company if they're cagey or not being transparent about what that contract says. And you should get that contract reviewed by a professional. That means a lawyer. It's worth the couple $100 to have somebody look over that contract so that you don't get stuck later. Because I have seen contracts where if you get fired or dismissed during the program, you have to reimburse them for the training. And sometimes you might be dismissed and it's not even your fault. That might be because an employer pulled out or things like that. There's not a job there anymore. Things that are out of your control. You need to have an open conversation with the hire, train, deploy company about all those scenarios, the what ifs that could happen that could cost you money. And speaking of those employers, every hire, train, deploy firm should be willing to share with you who their employer partners are. You should never sign up for a hire, train, deploy program if you don't at least know which companies you have a shot at being placed at, because you're going to want to research those companies, because there are companies out there that you don't want to work for. And you're going to want to go check out Glassdoor, and you're going to want to talk to people on LinkedIn about those companies and do your research just like you would for a regular job. Because again, if you get hired and you don't like it there, you're going to be stuck there for a period of time. So doing that research and doing that homework up front about who those employer partners are is really important to this process. And last but not least, be sure to check that contract for relocation requirements. National staffing firms, the larger firms in this space, they have employers all over the country, and you may need to be willing to relocate for that job. And if that's a deal breaker for you, you need to know that up front. You need to see that in the contract. And another thing you might want to consider in the contract is if you do have to relocate, is there any stipend? Is there any reimbursement for that relocation? Or are you going to have to fund that yourself? That can be a nasty surprise for learners who get placed with a company and then are forced to relocate on their own dime. Now, I don't have any statistics on how many companies will pay for relocation versus not. It's just something that you need to be aware of and prepare for. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is if you are going to apply for one of these programs, what are some ways that you can maximize your chances of being accepted? And to talk about this, we kind of got to flip it back around. The staffing firm is making a bet. They are betting that the candidates that they bring into the program are going to be successful and the employers are going to desire them. So they are trying to minimize their risk. Well, if you're hiring somebody to learn how to code, what is the best way to minimize the risk? And the answer is to select people that already have foundational knowledge of that coding skill. Now, you don't have to go all the way. You don't have to go from zero to employed, take a boot camp, and then go to hire, train, deploy. That's not what I'm asking you to do. But if you have mastered the foundations of a programming language, like say for Java, you might learn about variables, loops, conditional statements, classes, interfaces, unit testing, all those core basics that let you start your programming journey. And this is about 400 or 500 hours of learning. If you can walk into a hire, train, deploy interview and demonstrate that you are comfortable with that foundational knowledge, the risk goes way down and your chances of making it through that interview go way up. The other things that you can do is really focus on your communication skills, because employers in tech do tend to value soft skills almost as much as the hard skills. Obviously, you have to know how to code to get a coding job, but when people are similar level of technical skill, the people who are good communicators, good organizers, have good soft skills, they are going to rise to the top. And oftentimes when you're interviewing for a hire, train, deploy program, it is going to be an actual interview process. So you are going to do a pre-assessment kind of technical interview. It's not going to ask you necessarily to write some code, but some of them do. But they are going to check your logic and reasoning and your programming meta skills at minimum. You're also going to have a behavioral interview, and that's where you're going to have to come prepared, just like any behavioral interview. How do you deal with conflict? How do you communicate well? What type of work environment do you enjoy? You need to come prepared to talk about those things and really impress the interviewer, because you are interviewing for a job. It's just your job is to learn. So to wrap things up, hire, train, deploy programs are out there. You should be aware of them. They are going to grow. They are continuing to grow. I do a lot of consulting on the side for these programs, kind of helping them set up a good learning environment. The coding boot camps, as we know, are struggling. And as the coding bootcamp market shrinks, I think that hire, train, deploy is going to grow to kind of take the place of those coding boot camps. And at the end of the day, I think this is a relatively positive development for learners, because getting paid to learn is a lot better than shelling out $20,000 to a coding bootcamp and then coin flipping on a job. Now, these programs are very competitive to get into, so it's not going to reduce the need to have formal education. It's not going to reduce the need to self-study like you can do at Foundry. Getting those fundamentals and kind of coming in with just a cut above people who aren't as well prepared is going to be the best way to get these opportunities. Happy coding.